What is located on 95% of empty Malaysia? The first answer is the most misleading one. Not nothing, but a vast interior that has never behaved like empty space at all. From the outside, the system looks full. People live at the margins, trade moves, cities concentrate power, and the country reads as settled. But once you look past the inhabited edge, a contradiction appears. The center remains thinly held, underused, repeatedly entered, and repeatedly given back. That is the real mystery here. Not why people arrived late, and not why development somehow forgot a giant piece of land, but why so much apparent room has stayed resistant for so long. If this were just a temporary gap, the pattern would have closed. If it were simply a matter of ambition, money, or policy, someone would already have forced permanence into place. Yet the void persists. So the investigation is not about absence in the simple sense. It is about pressure, cost, and failure. It is about a region that keeps turning expansion into withdrawal and plans into defensive lines. To understand what is really located inside that emptiness, you have to test a harder possibility, that the void survives because the interior itself keeps defeating the idea of easy settlement. The first clue is never found in a dramatic revelation. It is found in leftovers. You see the remains of attempts that once assumed the interior could be made ordinary. Not ruins in the romantic sense, but quieter evidence of interrupted confidence. Foundations without follow-through, routes that seem to point toward permanence and then lose purpose, clusters that were meant to become more than they ever did. Every one of those traces carries the same message. Someone thought the interior could be converted into a stable human space. Someone believed access would improve, supply would normalize, and daily life would eventually feel routine. And then something stronger answered back. Attempt number one, in other words, did not fail because no one tried. It failed because trying was not enough. What looks, at first glance, like underdevelopment begins to read more like collision. Human intention moved inward with a theory of control. The interior responded with distance, friction, exposure, and maintenance burdens that did not disappear once the first road, outpost, or service point appeared. The abandoned ambition matters because it changes the question. The issue is no longer whether the interior held potential. It is why potential kept breaking against conditions that were more durable than the plan. Follow the main corridor inward, and the pattern sharpens. Repetition becomes evidence. The line stretches on, but the sense of connection does not deepen with it. Distance expands faster than density. Contact becomes intermittent. Services thin out. The same practical adaptations appear again and again, as if ordinary life has to be renegotiated every few kilometers. Storage becomes more important. Repair becomes more important. Redundancy becomes more important. Small failures can no longer stay small because help is farther away. Replacement is slower, and every delay compounds the next one. Even the built environment starts to look less like expansion and more like self-defense. Hard edges appear where vulnerability has been learned the expensive way. The corridor is not simply a route through empty land. It is a transcript of prolonged struggle. Monotony is part of the clue. So is the sparse contact. So is the way infrastructure feels less like a promise of future growth than a chain of protected footholds trying not to lose what they already hold. If broad permanence were natural here, the corridor would thicken as it advanced. Instead, it keeps having to reassert itself. That is what an actively resistant interior looks like. Not dramatic refusal at every step, but relentless pressure that prevents one thin line from ever becoming a broad, stable human field. At some point, every system like this produces a barrier set piece, the place where the conflict between plan and pressure becomes visible enough that even optimism has to speak in defensive terms. It may not announce itself as a wall. More often, it appears as a limit line, the point beyond which maintenance becomes harder than expansion, response becomes slower than breakdown, and every additional kilometer must justify itself against risk that no spreadsheet can fully tame. What matters is not the exact form, but what the barrier reveals. It did not emerge by accident. It was built, reinforced, revised, and respected because repeated contact with the interior taught the same lesson over time. Beyond a certain threshold, the land stops behaving like a passive backdrop for policy and starts behaving like an actor with its own veto. The barrier, then, is not just engineering. It is memory made visible. It records floods of cost, waves of damage, failures of replacement, and the repeated discovery that what lies beyond the line consumes attention faster than institutions can replenish it. That is why the system starts to look defensive, even when it is still nominally expanding. The interior has already imposed terms. The barrier stands because the struggle has been going on for years, and because the people responsible for holding the line have learned that neglect can travel inward as fast as ambition once moved out. That is the moment when folklore enters. In places shaped by long uncertainty, people do not leave the pattern unexplained. They populate it with stories, disappearances, bad luck, wrong turns, strange silences, places where confidence seems to drain away for reasons no map can capture. The deeper the interior remains resistant, the easier it becomes to imagine that resistance as personality. A place does not merely wear people down, it wants them gone. A route does not merely become dangerous, it rejects those who trust it too much. Folklore matters because it intensifies the unease, and because it reveals what repeated failure feels like from the ground. When a system keeps producing the same losses, myth gives those losses a face. But folklore is not the final answer. It is a symptom of a pattern that people experience before they fully explain. The real work begins when you strip away the aura without dismissing what the aura is trying to tell you. The stories survive because something truly is wrong with the easy version of settlement here. The interior really does seem to swallow confidence. The mistake is to stop at myth. The stronger explanation is material. Roads fail. Supply chains lengthen. Maintenance costs compound. Exposure punishes small mistakes. Perception grows out of structure. The unease is real. But its deepest cause is not supernatural. It is systemic. Then comes the paradox that keeps drawing people back. The interior does not present itself as worthless. On the contrary, it often seems to hold exactly the kind of opportunity that should justify a permanent push inward. Space, resources, strategic depth, room for extraction, cultivation, storage, or expansion. From a distance, that looks like latent wealth. It suggests that the emptiness is temporary, that one more investment cycle could finally convert promise into permanence. But this is where appearances become expensive. Wealth on paper is not the same as wealth that can sustain daily life. Opportunity at scale is not the same as a place where people can live broadly, repeatedly, and affordably enough for settlement to reproduce itself without constant rescue. Extraction may be possible while permanence remains fragile. A system can remove value from the interior without ever truly domesticating it. That difference is decisive. You can take things out of a difficult place for a time. It is much harder to build a durable society deep inside one. Every kilometer of access must be maintained. Every service point must be supplied. Every household must absorb the premium imposed by distance, repair, energy, spoilage, and delay. Under those conditions, abundance becomes selective. The interior may produce value, but it does not easily circulate value into broad permanence. That is why apparent wealth and chronic fragility can coexist for decades without canceling each other out. Naturally, people go hunting for a leverage point, the one exception that will overturn the whole logic. Somewhere, it is said, there must be a local advantage strong enough to anchor lasting settlement, a patch of unusually favorable ground, a pocket of more stable conditions, a hidden reserve, a climatic loophole, a technical fix that reduces the old penalties. And sometimes such leverage points do exist. For a while, they can feel like proof that the interior is finally yielding. Costs fall just enough. Yields rise just enough. Optimism returns. The map begins to look different, but the miracle almost never scales cleanly. The advantage is too localized, too fragile, too expensive to protect, or too finite to support the larger dream attached to it. What solved one settlement does not solve the corridor. What stabilized one site does not stabilize the network. What looked like a breakthrough becomes a workaround with strict limits. That distinction is crucial because it explains the rhythm of enthusiasm and retreat. The system does not fail because no one found a useful exception. It fails because exceptions cannot easily carry the burden of an entire interior. Once maintenance, transport, staffing, and replacement rise back into view, the leverage point shrinks to its real size. It was never a key to the whole void. It was a temporary shelter inside it. By this stage, the investigation has to step below roads and budgets and ask a more uncomfortable question. What if the substrate itself is the problem? Not just the visible surface, and not just the logistics laid on top of it, but the deeper material base on which permanence depends. A region can look spacious and still be structurally poor at sustaining repeated growth. Ground can be thin in the ways that matter most. Productive layers can exhaust quickly. Recovery can lag behind use. Support systems that appear abundant can prove surprisingly weak once scaled. When that happens, every new plan begins with a hidden deficit. The first years may still look promising because the easiest gains arrive early. Then the underlying weakness begins to show. Maintenance gets harder, not easier. Returns flatten. Inputs rise. Stability depends on increasing intervention just to hold yesterday's level. In a more forgiving environment, time helps settlement. In a resistant one, time exposes the bargain that was there from the beginning. This is why the interior can feel deceptive. Its problem is not always spectacular disaster. More often, it is structural fatigue. Systems that should mature instead stall. Projects that should consolidate instead become dependent. Communities that should spread instead remain isolated. Once you see the substrate is aging, exhaustible, or simply unable to support the imagined scale, the emptiness stops looking like a temporary blank and starts looking like the visible surface of a much deeper limit. Geography then sharpens that limit into a pattern. The life-giving inputs do not distribute themselves evenly. just because a map suggests they could. Movement follows the path of least resistance. Capital follows reliability. Labor follows opportunity with the lowest daily penalty. Services follow concentration. Even moisture, heat, and air can sort a landscape into zones of relative favor and chronic stress. The result is a gatekeeper effect. The margins keep receiving what helps systems persist, while the core keeps absorbing what makes persistence costly. In that arrangement, the interior is not merely distant, it is repeatedly outcompeted. Every advantage that reaches it has already paid a toll. Every household, facility, or route operating there must spend more effort to secure the same baseline that the margins achieve with less strain. This is why edge growth and interior emptiness can reinforce each other, rather than resolve each other. Success at the margins does not automatically spill inward. It can just as easily drain the core by pulling resources, talent, and maintenance attention back toward the places that are easier to keep alive. The gatekeeper is therefore not a single checkpoint or natural obstacle. It is the whole geometry of circulation. The system keeps feeding the edges because the edges convert support into stability more efficiently, while the core keeps losing the competition for permanence. And even if a society decides to endure all of that, one final destabilizer remains: the long cycle trigger. The interior is hardest on plans that assume tomorrow will resemble today. Over a few months, a difficult place can still look manageable. Over years, recurring shifts expose how little room for error was ever there. Conditions fluctuate, access changes, costs return in waves. A route that seemed viable becomes uncertain. A maintenance burden deferred in 1 year arrives multiplied in the next. Institutions rotate personnel, priorities, and budgets. Investors lose patience. Families make rational decisions about risk. What collapses is not just infrastructure, but planning confidence itself. Once the long cycle enters the picture, permanence has to survive not only ordinary difficulty, but repeated phases in which every unresolved weakness is tested again. That is the final clue. And it is also the synthesis. The abandoned attempts, the thin corridor, the defensive barrier, the folklore of vanishing certainty, the resource paradox, the failed miracle, the exhausted substrate, and the edge-fed geography all point to the same conclusion. The void inside empty Malaysia is not accidental. It is not a simple oversight. It is not merely underdeveloped land waiting for the right decade. It is a systemic outcome produced by a resistant interior that raises the cost of permanence at every level, from the household to the state. What is located there, in the end, is not emptiness in the naive sense. It is a standing demonstration that space alone does not create settlement, that apparent wealth does not guarantee livability, and that some interiors remain thinly held because the system beneath them keeps saying no.